Welcome to New Wave Jiu-Jitsu, Positional Escapes, and New Philosophy. The final goal of New Wave Jiu-Jitsu is to create a generation of Jiu-Jitsu athletes who strongly emphasize a positive attacking game going from control to submission. Ironically, the first step towards that goal is to build a cast iron defense. When people come to watch me coaching my athletes, they're often struck by the fact that a very, very significant part of every training session is built around defensive skills. This is shocking because most people associate strong attacking game as the definitive feature of the squad. Why do I put such a heavy emphasis on strong defensive skills? It's because defense is the source, the bedrock of all your attacking confidence. Always remember that attack in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu has two elements. The first is the most obvious, and that is physical ability. You have to know the attacking moves. You have to know your leg locks, your arm bars, your strangleholds, etc. But there's a second element that gets talked about a lot less. This is the mental element. Always remember that every attack is ultimately a choice on the part of the athlete. At some point, the athlete has to choose to pull the trigger when the opportunity is there. That mental aspect can confound many athletes. The world is full of athletes who have a great physical ability to attack, but when the moment is there, will hang back and won't pull the trigger. Why? What's the reason for this? Ultimately, it comes down to a fear with regards to the consequences of a failed attack. Failed attacks in Jiu-Jitsu render you somewhat vulnerable. Very often, you will see after a failed attack a loss of points or some kind of positional compromise. If you truly believe that your submission attack could possibly be followed by positional compromise from which you cannot recover, you won't attack. You might have all the physical ability in the world, but your own mind will hold you back and prevent you attacking. Despite the fact you had all the physical ability, you didn't have that mental confidence to pull the trigger. My goal as a coach is to get my athletes to a point where they believe so resolutely in their defensive acumen and their ability to recover from any kind of positional compromise that they will attack at will with no fear of consequences. Understand always that the traditional approach to Jiu-Jitsu is extremely conservative. Essentially, it works with three understandings of position. There are dominant positions, there are neutral positions, and there are inferior positions. Traditional Jiu-Jitsu takes an approach that any time you find yourself in an inferior position, your duty and your goal is to get back to a neutral position. This is almost always some version of guard position. Guard, by definition, is a neutral position in the sport, and anytime you find yourself in a bad pin, your duty is to work your way back to guard. I want to supplement this time-tested traditional approach with a new philosophy. Traditional Jiu-Jitsu is ultimately a satisficing philosophy. This is the idea that most Jiu-Jitsu players are satisfied with a good enough outcome. And for them, good enough means getting back to neutrality. If you're mounted, you elbow escape, get back to guard, that's good enough. Stop there, and then once you're in guard, figure out where you want to go going forward. I want to supplement this with a maximizing approach. The idea behind this is that there are mental components to the sport of Jiu-Jitsu which can create great opportunities for counterattacks when we get out of pins. Think about the psychological notion of sunk costs. If you invest heavily into some project and for whatever reason at a later date you have to invest again, you will do so readily because you've already sunk a large amount of time, effort, or money into the original project. Each time the project runs into difficulties further down the line, you'll be happy to invest more and more. Why? Because you've already invested so much that for you to stop now would mean losing everything you've already worked so hard to put in. Sunk costs apply very heavily in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Everything we do in the sport costs us energy and sweat. When someone gets to a dominant position, it costs them a considerable amount. They're very reluctant to give it up when you begin to escape. This means that most athletes will take risks and compromises in body position and posture when they try to hold on to a pin that they feel they're losing that they would normally never take. As a result, their bodies tend to become very vulnerable and very extended. There's an old cliche that a boxer is never more vulnerable than when he's throwing a punch. The same is true in Jiu-Jitsu. An athlete in Jiu-Jitsu is never more vulnerable than when they're trying to hold on to a pin that is failing. As their body becomes extended and the principle of sunk costs kicks in, and they simply refuse to give up on what appears to be a failing project simply because they've already invested so much energy into getting where they are. At that point, a counterattack will usually prove to be decisive. There are tremendous opportunities as an opponent tries to hold on and maintain a pin that is failing. As they become extended, they become extremely vulnerable to submission holds. A useful distinction made in this video is that of upper body dominant pins and lower body dominant pins. There are 5 pins in Jiu-Jitsu. 2 of them, north-south and side control, are anchored primarily with the arms. 3 of them, knee on belly, mount, and rear mount, are anchored primarily with the legs. In the case of leg dominant pins, I should be prepared to go into an immediate counterattack out of the pin directly into my opponent's legs. So when we escape mount, rear mount, and knee on belly, characteristically, we go directly into leg attacks. When we escape from north-south and side control, characteristically, we go into upper body attacks. But because of the very nature of the position, typically what will happen is the opponent will pull away from the upper body attacks, but the mere act of pulling away will leave their legs vulnerable to a follow-up leg attack. And so the pattern that we explore in this video is of direct leg attacks against leg pins and of indirect leg attacks against upper body pins. This maximizing approach to pin escapes will create a generation of exciting Jiu-Jitsu athletes where they display the best aspects of the sport, cast iron defense along with aggressive offense. Welcome to the New Wave series. It's a no-gi series featuring the tactics and skills as shown by the squad in competition, in particular ADCC type competition. As such, its primary interest is the integration of submission systems with positional pressure. My long-term goal in this video series is to make you, working from your own location, into a very aggressive, confident, attacking Jiu-Jitsu player. A Jiu-Jitsu player with an unusually high ability to control opponents and work your way into submission holds against someone your own size and your own skill level. Interestingly, the first step in building you up as an aggressive, risk-taking Jiu-Jitsu player, paradoxically, is to focus on defense. A little known fact about my coaching program is that it always begins with a cast iron defense. There is literally not a single day where even my top athletes don't spend at least half of their training time working their way out of bad or inferior positions. This is such a huge part of my training program that many people, when they first encounter it, are somewhat surprised, because normally my students are associated with a very strong attacking style of Jiu-Jitsu. And they're somewhat taken aback by the idea that when it's time to go into the room and train, over 50% of the training time is actually built towards defensive aspects of Jiu-Jitsu. There's a very simple reason for this. It is my earnest belief that almost all confidence in your attacks in Jiu-Jitsu is directly proportional to your confidence in your defense. The reasoning for this is very simple. Jiu-Jitsu attacks are all about risk. Anytime you go to attack someone, you are, in a sense, compromising your balance and your stance and your posture. Because some kind of risk is entailed, if the attack should fail, there can be dire consequences. So, for example, if I have Positional on my guard, and however we do it, I work my way up into, say, a triangle. Okay. As I work for the triangle, there's always a chance. I'm sure you guys have all been here 1,000 times. You have a bigger, stronger opponent. He just starts bullying his way around the side. My triangle gets put under pressure, more and more pressure. Pressure brings his head over my head until, oh no, there's a slip, and then he ends up passing my guard. Okay. And there's a sense in which Jiu-Jitsu kind of punishes risk. I took the risk of going for a submission hold that we're told that's the good thing to do, but leaving the tight defensive postures of guard position and going into that risky submission got punished. And as a result, I ended up getting pinned. Now, if I get pinned underneath someone and I can't get out, pretty soon I'm going to start thinking in the following way. I'm going to think to myself, every time I attempt a submission, I either get it or the guy breaks out and pins me and I can't escape. It's human nature under those circumstances to start avoiding risk. You're going to start going for fewer and fewer submissions as you go with better and better opponents. Because every time you lose the submission, you feel you get pinned and you can't get out of the pin. And as a result, even though you have the ability to attack someone, you don't have the confidence to do it. Always remember that when it comes to offense, there's two aspects to it. There's your physical ability to perform the submission. Many people have that. And there's your confidence that you'll actually pull the trigger when the opportunity arises in a competitive situation. And those are two very different things. The world is full of people who have a ton of physical ability to perform a move. If you ask them to perform an armbar, they look beautiful. But when they're out there in the heat of competition, they won't pull the trigger. Why? Because they don't believe in their defense. In the back of their mind is a nagging doubt that if the submission doesn't work, they're in deep trouble. And when that nagging doubt is there in the back of your mind, and that fleeting opportunity comes for your attack, you're going to hold back. You're going to doubt yourself. And you're going to say, is this worth the risk? And by the time you come to an answer, the opportunity's gone. That's why I earnestly believe that the basis of building a strong, attacking, proactive form of jiu-jitsu begins with defense. All of my students excel in defensive skills. You would often see this, for example, in EBI competition, where my students built a very, very impressive record working out of armbar situations and back situations. The two most prolific champions in EBI history, Gary Tonin and Gordon Ryan, were never submitted in EBI overtime, despite often going against players far larger than themselves. They were able to get out very, very easily and had an amazing win record under the pressure of EBI overtime and showed their defensive acumen. When you have that kind of confidence in your defense, you will attack at every opportunity because you no longer have a fear of bad consequences. If you truly believe in your mind that no one in the world can pin you and no one in the world can submit you, you will attack at will because you no longer have any fear of bad consequences. You think to yourself, well, if I go for that triangle and the guy passes my guard, so what? I'll get out in 5 seconds and I'll just start attacking again. It's so important, I'll say it again. All of your offensive confidence comes out of your defensive confidence. And if you don't have that defensive confidence, when it comes time to pull the trigger in competition, you won't. You'll doubt yourself and you'll delay and the opportunity will be gone. And so even though my overall goal in this video series is to build you, as I said, into a strong, proactive, attacking jiu-jitsu player who tries to earnestly work from control to submission, your first step is to build a cast iron defense. Because that cast iron defense is going to give you the second key ingredient to attacking confidence. The first is physical skill. We'll spend a lot of time on that throughout this video series. But the second one is much less understood and is much less common. And that is attacking confidence. Confidence doesn't come from words from a sports psychologist. It comes from results on the mat. And it comes from the fact that on the mat, you have proven to yourself and other people that no one can pin you and no one can submit you. Once you have that as a physical skill, then suddenly the confidence rises and your attack rate in competitive situations will double or triple in a very short period of time. The more you're attacking, the more success you're going to have with your attacks. It's just how it works. And so our first step, ironically, in building you towards a strong attacking game in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu is to push you towards very, very strong defense. If you go to almost any Jiu-Jitsu beginner class, you'll see a pretty similar thing across the board, no matter where you are in the world. There is a heavy emphasis on the building of defensive skills at white belt level. And that's a wise approach, okay? Because when you're a white belt, you have no skills. You go into a class, everyone else has more skills than you. They may not be experts, but they're certainly more expert than you are. And as a result, your first few days in Jiu-Jitsu, you're inevitably in the bottom of the mountain, bottom side control. And so most teaching curriculums start off with defensive skills, as I said, a wise choice. Let's understand that the traditional approach to defense in Jiu-Jitsu is a more or less a binary approach, okay? Traditionally, Jiu-Jitsu has strongly separated defensive skills and offensive skills, okay? This is based around the theory that there are three types of position in Jiu-Jitsu. There are dominant positions, there are neutral positions, and there are inferior positions. So, for example, if Placido is on top of me in the mounted position, this would be a classic example of a situation where the top man is in a thoroughly dominant position and I, conversely, am in an inferior position. My goal in Jiu-Jitsu, at least according to the traditional method, is to work my way out of the inferior position and get back to a neutral position. So, for example, we could go for a standard form of elbow escape, which takes me now to a neutral position, guard. So we went from inferior to neutral. Once I'm in neutral position, then I can focus on offense. And say, for example, we might come all the way up on a training partner and knock them over. And now we find ourselves having turned everything around in a massively dominant position. And so that would be a simple expression of that basic three types of position philosophy in classic Jiu-Jitsu. You're either inferior, neutral, or dominant. Traditionally, Jiu-Jitsu has had this binary approach where you focus on one, then you get to the neutral position, and then you focus on the other. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that approach. It's an excellent approach, which is stood the test of time. Even now, my students do use it. It's not the optimal approach. I promise you we'll start to move along soon. But this is the traditional one, which I was brought up with. You're probably learning somewhere in the world right now. It's not the only way of doing things. My biggest goal in this video is to present an alternative mindset to Escape, which greatly narrows the division between defense and offense. Traditionally, Jiu-Jitsu has built into its athletes a mindset where when they're in a bad position, their only thought is defense. Get out of the bad position. That's it. Okay, you're in trouble, get out of trouble. Once you're out of trouble and get back to neutrality, then you can start thinking about offense. That's always been the traditional approach. Again, not a bad approach, and still one which has tremendous validity in the world today. But it's not the only approach. My intention in this video is to narrow the distinction between defense and offense so that you, as a developing student, can start counterattacking out of bad positions. And by narrowing the distinction between offense and defense, create a much more overall attacking style where you're going for a higher rate of submissions in a given time frame than you would using the traditional approach. Always remember that the traditional approach is based around this key idea of a binary split where you're either defensive mode or you're offensive mode. It's a little bit like American football where they have a defensive team and an offensive team. Okay, in Jiu-Jitsu, you have your defensive skills here, you have your offensive skills here, and somewhere in between them is this realm of neutrality. You start off inferior, you get to neutral, and only when you got to neutral can you start thinking about offense. My goal is to bring offense and defense together and start looking at this idea of neutrality and observe it in a new light, which will greatly increase the number of submissions you hit per minute in a competitive match. Broadly speaking, there are two major types of defensive skills in Jiu-Jitsu. There are pin escapes and there are submission escapes. Okay, a pin is a positional threat. Okay, where I'm being controlled. I'm under no threat of bodily damage in a grappling match, but I am being controlled in positions like so. Now, this stands in contrast with a submission threat, where now not only am I being controlled, but I'm being controlled in a way which could potentially damage my body and force me to surrender. Okay, positional threats are to my torso. So when I'm being pinned, it's my torso that's typically being pinned. Submission threats are to my limbs, whether they be joint locks or whether they be strangles. Okay. This video will deal with both. And I hope to impress you with the idea that they can be dealt with in a way where you're not just thinking defensively, but also counter-offensively. And if we can turn you into a counter-offense jiu-jitsu player, we can double or triple the number of submissions you're going to attempt on your opponent in a given time frame than what you currently are. So the video will focus over time on pin escapes, positional threats, and submission escapes. We'll look at the most common forms of pin and the most common and effective forms of submission in modern day jiu-jitsu, and give a very comprehensive look at how to get out of these problems. Now, we're going to teach you to get out of all of the major pins of jiu-jitsu in a relatively short period of time. Your first skill, you've got to be able to get out of a pin. Very soon, we're going to start looking at what we can do when we get out of a pin in terms of turning it into counter offense. But your first skill, you've got to be able to get out of a pin. Okay, first, what is a pin? What are we fighting against? We've got to know what the problem is in order to solve the problem. A pin is essentially a set of wedges that I put around my opponent's body, reinforced by both the floor and my body weight. Okay, so for example, if I take my arm and wedge it underneath my training partner's far shoulder and my elbow wedges underneath Placido's head, and then I wedge my second forearm underneath the near hip, and I reinforce this with body weight, keeping my head wedged here against his hip. When Placido goes to move around, he finds there's a set of wedges locked around his body. Okay, I only have so many wedges to use, so I have to be judicious in where I select to put them based upon what kind of problem I'm looking to create for my opponent. If, for example, I use a reverse crossface, that does an excellent job of wedging Placido's head on the far side of his body. So if Placido tries to move his head away from me, there's a lot of resistance. My thigh on the near side makes it difficult for Placido to move his body towards me. If Placido tries to move his hip towards me for an elbow escape, it's wedged by my right arm. But you'll notice there is no wedge here. So Placido could shrimp away from me and cause problems. Okay, I could change that by repositioning my body and putting a wedge to control that far hip. So now when Placido goes to move the far hip and shrimp, there's resistance. Okay, I could change the position of my crossface and lock up like so. I could close the wedges and lock them together using my hands like this. Okay, now when Placido goes to move around, again, he finds there are wedges distributed around his hips, head, and shoulders. There's a sense in which your limbs can be used in a similar fashion to a doorstop underneath a door, which will hold a door in place even during a hurricane. Your job is to take the limbs of your body and strategically place wedges around your opponent's body, typically the torso and the head. And if we can do this, you can restrain someone from moving. Okay? At the same time, I want to reinforce those wedges with my body weight. Now, unfortunately, many people misunderstand pins as body weight primary. Okay? They think the body weight is the basis of the pin. In fact, the body weight is almost useless for pinning people. Okay? We can do a simple experiment. I'm just going to put all of my body weight on Placido's chest, like so. You can see I have no wedges around Placido's body. I have a very high percentage of my body weight on him because I have no contact with the floor except for my toes. But Placido can easily move underneath me and effortlessly put me back in guard. Body weight doesn't stop people from moving. Here, I'm going to keep my chest off Placido. Okay, I don't know if you're going to pick this up on camera, but if I place wedges around Placido's body, here I have a set of wedges, but I have no chest contact. So I have literally zero body weight on Placido's body. But when he goes to put me back in guard, the wedges do a very good job of holding him in place. So really what the mechanical mechanism for a pin is bound around is the idea of creating wedges around my opponent's head, shoulders, and hips, and my body weight just reinforces them. So when Placido goes to move around, it's those wedges that are typically holding him in place. And then I just use my body weight as a method of reinforcing those and cementing them in place. But it's the wedges that do the work. When we go to pin people, you're going to see that this simple insight of a set of wedges placed around the body, reinforced by body weight, is the problem that you, as a developing jiu-jitsu athlete, will be working against when it's time for you to get out of a bad pin. Okay? And now in the next section, we're going to start looking at the beginnings of a solution to that problem. Okay, so what about to get out of anybody's pin? Here's the first step. Whenever you are in a pin, we've seen that a pin is composed of a set of wedges placed around the body, reinforced by your opponent's body weight. You must start to develop an understanding of inside and outside positioning. Okay? This pin that Placido has is a fight of his limbs, which are his wedges, versus mine. My ultimate goal is to get my limbs inside my opponent's limbs. I want to create my own wedges inside his wedges. As long as Placido has the inside position with his limbs, if you look at, just rotate this way for a second, look at Placido's right knee. It is currently inside my hip, and it's blocking my ability to put him back in guard. So he has inside position with his right knee. Right. Placido has inside and under position with his underhook. Lock your hands. Okay. I cannot get my hands inside his. His head is inside my shoulder, and as a result plays a nullifying effect on my own head. I can't move my head freely. Like so. Like this. Okay, look, strong head. Now my head is locked. Okay, here's the inside position. His head against my shoulder. So he's inside at my arm. He's inside with his head. He's inside with his right knee. Come around even further. Now, his shoulder is inside my shoulder. Here. And bring your knee underneath my head. His hip is inside my elbow. So Placido has maximal inside position. Every one of his limbs, from shoulders to elbows to knees, is inside mine. This is a 100% losing position for me. I have no inside real estate whatsoever. Placido has everything. What I need to do is start finding inside position. You're going to see that in any given pin, there's always an optimal first item of inside position. In the case of a side control, it's usually inside the hip. That's usually the easiest one to get and the most significant. Once you get one item of inside position, you suddenly find you have a little more mobility than previously. And you find that getting the second item of inside position is not so difficult. Then from here, we start to work until space starts to generate, until you start getting more and more inside position on your opponent. A critical point, rotate around. A critical point gets reached where I have more limbs inside him than he has inside of me. That is the critical tipping point. Once you have more of your limbs inside his, then escape becomes quite simple. And you can go back, if you're a conservative player, to a neutral position like guard, or as we'll see later on in this video, you can adopt a different philosophy where you start going into attacks. That is the general playbook that will play itself out again and again throughout this video. This is a battle of his limbs versus yours. His limbs are being used as wedges around your body. As long as his limbs are inside your limbs, that's a winning strategy for him. Your goal is to use the techniques and tactics that I'll be showing you throughout this video to get more and more of your limbs inside his. It will start incrementally, usually with one limb getting inside. Then there will be an incremental process over time where you get progressively more and more of your hands, elbows, shoulders, head, knees, feet inside his limbs. There's going to come a critical tipping point where you have majority inside control. There's more of your limbs inside his than he has inside you. When you get to that critical tipping point, you are out. You can start moving your opponent quite easily, even though you're underneath him. He no longer has sufficient wedge control to immobilize you. And now, despite being underneath his body weight, you can move freely and either go into a neutral defensive position, a neutral traditional position such as guard, or the philosophy that we'll be looking at in this video, to go immediately into your counterattacks. That's the basic mechanism by which pins are made and pins are broken. Pins are made by wedges supported by body weight. Pins are broken by progressively getting more and more inside control over time, usually starting with just one item and building from there, until ultimately you get majority inside control. And the second you get majority inside control, you are now in charge. Then you can move freely. You can go traditional route and move back to a neutral guard position, or you can go with my philosophy, which is go directly into a form of attack instead of just neutral guard position. And that will be our guiding philosophy as we work our way through the various pin escapes that will be shown in this video. Now, I want to look at a subject which is essentially the core theme of this video. This is the idea that there is an element of psychology involved behind escape. People talk all the time about psychology in sports, and normally when they do so, it's kind of wishy-washy garbage of, talking yourself into confidence and visualization and other highfalutin ideas like that. I prefer a much more practical way of looking at the ways in which psychology influences performance in sport, and a much more tangible, concrete way in which psychology really does play a role has to do with directing our behaviors. When most people go to escape, they're held back by their own mindset, which is a result of the traditional approach to training escapes in Jiu-Jitsu. Traditionally, as we saw earlier in this video, Jiu-Jitsu is satisfied with getting out of a bad position into a neutral position. So, show me any Jiu-Jitsu beginners class in America, someone's mounted, and you'll see everyone gets taught classic elbow escape. You put the man back in a neutral position, like guard, and the move is now complete. You have gone from an inferior position to a neutral position. Now you switch your mindset. You say, okay, the defensive skill has been exercised. Now it's time for me to go into my offensive skills. And then you'll see them go for arm bars, triangles, etc. So that's the traditional approach. As I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with that. It's tried and true, and you can get all the way to a world championship with that approach. There's a sense in which this is the satisficing mindset. The idea is that you're happy enough with the result you got. It was a good result, but it's not the only mindset you can adopt. The big theme that I'm going to push on you in this video is that traditionally, Jiu-Jitsu is satisfied with guard position. If you look at the overwhelming majority of escapes in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, they are escapes to guard. Whether it be me putting my opponent back in my guard or me trapping an opponent and ending up in his guard. Okay, in both cases, whether I end up in his guard or I put him back in my guard, you've ended up in a neutral position, and that would count as an escape in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. This is not the only way of doing things. The philosophy which I'm going to push on you throughout this video is the maximizing philosophy. We're going to go beyond satisficing philosophy, the traditional approach, and into maximizing. The idea is it's no more difficult for me to put my opponent into a submission hold based around movements such as ashigarami, arm bars, the clamp position, don't worry, I'll explain that soon, than it is to put my opponent back in guard. Think about the notion of price, or the philosophy of price. If there were two items, A and B, and you strongly preferred A over B, if you were given a choice, which one would you rather have? You definitely have a preference for A. And someone came to you and said, I'll sell you A or B, and the prices are the same. Which one would you go for? Of course, you'd go for A, because you prefer it. It's your preferred option, and they're the same price. The only motivation that would make you go for B is if the price was radically lower. My point is this. The price in terms of energy expenditure and degree of difficulty of putting your opponent in ashigarami is identical to putting him back in guard. So why put him back in guard? Why not just put him in ashigarami? You can just attack him with a heel and finish the match. That's much better than going back to a neutral position. Who would rather go back to a neutral position than finish someone with a submission hold? Okay, one is obviously a better outcome. You finish someone with a finishing hold, that's the highest outcome in the sport. There's no better option. There's no better option than that. That's as good as it gets. Putting someone back in a neutral position doesn't guarantee anything. It just means you got back to your starting point. If it doesn't cost you any more to put the guy into a submission hold than it does to put him back in guard, why would anyone choose putting him back in guard? So, for example, if someone's across my side, I could, from the situation, go with the satisficing response and just put my opponent back in guard. But I could also go for a much more aggressive response where I go directly into a submission hold once the escape has been effected. That aggressive maximizing approach is the one I will be advocating in this video. Do I always advocate it? No, there are some situations. For example, if you're physically fatigued or if your opponent is predicting your attempts to go directly from pin to submission hold, where you might just be satisfied with the traditional satisficing model. But you will be pleasantly surprised to discover that in the majority of cases, you can employ the maximizing approach. This is the great theme of this video. I want you to change your mindset from satisficing, the traditional approach to escape, to maximizing. You will soon find that if you adopt the maximizing approach, the number of submissions you get to attempt per minute of play on the mat rises dramatically over situations where you adopt the old approach. You know, it's an interesting thing about Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu is one of the very few combat sports that has no real developed sense of counterattack. If you look at other combat sports, they have a highly developed sense of counterattack. In wrestling, the whole idea of a reshot a vast percentage of the successful takedowns in wrestling are reshots where someone shoots at you and you use their offense to go in and score the takedown on them. In striking martial arts, boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, there's whole chapters of those martial arts built around the idea of counterfighting, where someone throws a technique at you, you slip and evade and hit them. It's shocking to see the degree to which this is absent in jiu-jitsu, because we work with the old triadic approach of inferior, neutral, dominant. And we're satisfied with just getting out of a bad position. We don't think in terms of going directly into a counterattack. But the moment you start doing this, you're going to suddenly find that the number of submissions you attempt per minute of match goes up enormously. Now, every time you get in a bad situation, you're coming back hard at your opponent with a submission hold. Pretty soon, your opponent gets nervous about pinning you. Going, damn, every time I get a good position on this guy, he's trying to break my freaking legs. Okay, it gets nerve-wracking for the guy who's doing the pin. He's supposed to be confident, saying, oh, I've got this guy pinned there, he's under my control. And in the back of his mind, he's like, this guy could heel hook me at any moment if he gets out of this pin. It kind of takes away the edge of their pin. They're no longer thinking about going from pin to submission. They're worried about getting submitted themselves as they're pinning you. This maximizing mindset is what we'll be pushing throughout this video. I want you to change from satisficing, where you see it as good enough just to get out of the pin, and instead start looking for submission opportunities the minute you reach that critical tipping point when the pin has been broken and your mind switches in the blink of an eye from defensive concern right back to offensive concern. If you can do this, your submission rate will massively increase, and accordingly, the overall number of submissions you score in a given training session or a given tournament or match will also go up. I talked a little bit earlier about the idea of psychology and how it permeates into sports performance. There's a well-known and much studied psychological principle which often gets thrown around in the business world. This is the principle of sunk costs. The essential idea here is that as people invest more and more of their time, money, and effort into a given project, they will become more and more reluctant to pull out of that project if things start going wrong for them. So, for example, let's say you have a friend and he comes to you and he says, listen, man, I've got this project going on. It could make quite a bit of money. I really need $10,000, and I promise you in 6 months, I'll give you back $20,000. Now, you've known this guy a long time. You went to college together, high school. You trust him. So somewhat nervously, you get all your funds together and you give him 10 grand. You're apprehensive, but you trust him. He seems to have a good head on his shoulders, seems to know what he's talking about, and you sign over the $10,000. 3 weeks later, he comes back to you and goes, we spent the money and project's doing well. Things are good. Most things are on schedule, but we need a little more money. We need another $2,000. Can you spare $2,000? At this point, you're like, oh man, it's not good. It's like, it's not a good sign that they're asking for more money, but you've already put 10,000 in. And he's saying to you, if they don't get this money, the whole project's sunk. And you've already sunk 10,000 into the project. So now you're worried about losing 10,000. So you're like, oh my God, I don't want to lose $10,000. And if it only costs me 2,000 to save the 10,000, let me put the 2,000 in. So you put in an extra $2,000. A month later, he comes to you again. We're almost there. But we need another $5,000. Can you spare 5,000? Now at this point you're freaking out. You're like, oh my God, I'm already 12,000 in the hole here. But if I don't keep going now, I lose $12,000. And you can see what's happening here. You've invested so much in the project that now pulling out is going to kill you. And so you keep putting in more and more. And then of course one day the guy comes in and tells you the whole thing's folded and you lost $20,000. The world is full of examples of this kind of thing going on. And here's some news for you. Jiu-Jitsu is full of the same problem. Everything you do in Jiu-Jitsu is an investment in sweat, pain, and physical energy expenditure. If I take someone down, pass their guard, pin them, work my way all the way up to the mounted position, that's going to cost me a lot of energy. It's not easy to take down tough opponents. It's not easy to hold them down. It's not easy to pass their guard. It might take 8 minutes of hard work to pass a good guy's guard. I work my way through the various pins, and there I am, I'm mounted. If I start to lose that mount, what do you think I'm going to do? I've invested so much time and effort into getting mounted. I'm going to fight like a dog to keep myself mounted. I'm not going to give it up easily. So typically what we see when people are mounted or side mount or any other pin that you care to mention is that when they feel they're starting to lose the pin, as Placido's knees start coming in, when they feel they're about to lose it, you see them holding on, trying to get over the head, and you see them extending and fighting hard to retain it. And as Placido fights for the guard and I'm fighting for the pin, you see people getting out of balance, and oh my God, they tried so hard to keep what they've worked so hard to get to. They took risks that they normally wouldn't take. If I'm in Placido's guard, I will never start reaching for the head. That's suicide. Placido can do all kinds of things from here. Okay? I will never overextend my chest up to the line of his shoulders. This is suicide. I play the whole game back here, looking to get back up and away to my feet, away from my opponent. I play short because this is a potentially dangerous position. I would never take the risk of overextension in a position like this. It's suicide. But when I'm across side, I'll be happy to take those risks. As someone goes to escape, I'll use control of the head. I'll take risk with extension. I'll reach for the far hip as he tries to put me back in guard, and ultimately look to recover my position. I will reach and extend when I'm pinning people in ways that I would never do if I was inside their guard or inside their half guard. I'm happy to take those risks because it's an inherently safer position for me, and because I put so much effort into passing this guy's guard in the first place. I don't want to just give it up for free. It's the law of sunk costs applied in sports. Now, there's another law. This one doesn't apply in economics, but it sure as hell applies in Jiu-Jitsu. This is the law of extension. In Jiu-Jitsu, an extended opponent is a vulnerable opponent. The hardest people to attack with submission holds are contracted opponents. The easiest people to attack are extended opponents. Whenever someone goes to hold on to a pin, they inevitably become extended. When I hit a side pin on Placido, as the hips move and I start reaching for the hips, you get extension. And where there's extension, there's joint locks. Your goal is to use the principle of sunk costs and the principle of extension in concert with each other. Your opponents will try desperately to hold on to pins that are in the act of breaking because they put so much effort into getting them in the first place. They will take risks with extension of their limbs that they would normally never take. And in that moment of opportunity of a broken pin, you will suddenly find there are opportunities to submit people that you never even dreamed about. They are there right in front of you every single day, and for years you've been overlooking them. My goal in this video is to change that. My goal in this video is to get you thinking about escapes as the ultimate opportunity for submissions, because people are more extended holding on to failing pins than they are at any other time in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. A guy that I've always looked up to over the years is Bernard Hopkins. He was at a UFC once and he said something brilliant in front of us all. He said, a boxer is never more vulnerable than in the moment he goes to throw a punch. A boxer who's in stance, everything's covered up, it's hard to hit him. But the moment he steps forward and throws, he's extended, the balance is compromised, and the stance is broken. Where there's extension, punches can come in, over, all around. Exactly the same is true in Jiu-Jitsu. A guy who's contracted, very hard to submit. But a guy who's overextended, holding onto a pin longer than he should, easy as hell. My goal in this video is to switch your mindset onto this, to make you take seriously the interaction of the principle of sunk costs and the principle of extension. Anytime you break an opponent's pin, there is a very high likelihood your opponent will fall victim to those two principles. It will turn you from being someone who just passively gets out of bad positions into a neutral guard to someone who comes out of a pin, bam, right into a heel hook, right into an arm lock. And so people are almost afraid to pin you. Oh my God, every time I pin this guy, he breaks my freaking legs. Okay, that's what I want you steering towards. That's going to be the ultimate direction that this video takes. And speaking of that, it's time we go in that direction. We're very close now to starting out showing you how to actually get out of these positions and enact this new maximizing approach to escape. Let's start off with just a general game plan. What are we trying to do here? What's the big picture? It's always pretty much the same. Whenever we're in a pin situation, we want to start by taking our limbs to the inside position to the greatest degree possible. The more my opponent owns the inside position, the more he, as the pinning agent, can make a switch into submission holds. So my first thing, survive. Don't get in situations where not only is your opponent pinning you, Melton, but he's also extending your arm out and away from your body. Thank you. Remember, the law of extension goes both for you and against you. If I'm pinned and extended, I'm in deep shit, okay? We need a sense in which if we're going to be pinned, you can't be extended. So my first thing is, when you're in a pin type situation, bring everything in, especially the elbows and in some cases, the knees, depending on the nature of the pin, okay? What we can't do is get pinned and extended. That's when you get finished. So step number one is the survival step, where we bring elbows, knees, whatever is appropriate in. As a result, we're pinned, but we're not extended. That's step number one. Step number two is not always necessary, but in some cases it may be necessary. Sometimes you have to start off balancing people, okay? You might have to off balance them in certain situations. Side control. If I'm just being completely pinned in place here and I can't get my escapes to work, then there might have to be a period where we get the man out of balance. And that will enable us to start getting inside position, okay? Now, so we've got the idea of survival, bringing everything inside, the limbs in close to our body, in particular, knees and elbows. Then, not always the case, but often is the case, we have to create some kind of kazushi or off-balancing to disturb our opponent's balance. That almost always makes step three much easier. Step three is to gain sufficient inside control that we can create movement underneath an opponent's body weight. So for example, here, I take my limb to the inside. I take this elbow to the inside, I put my knee in place, and now my knee is in the inside. You have enough inside real estate now that from here I can start moving people. Okay, I can move freely underneath Placido's body weight now. Okay, technically his body is still on top of me, but you have sufficient inside space now that you can move freely in ways which will set up many forms of submission, as we'll see fairly shortly. And now, the next part of it. Arguably, the most important part. The critical tipping point. There will be a tipping point for every escape that I show you in this video where you go from defense to offense. Okay? There's a tipping point where everything happens in the briefest flash of time. If you can recognize what that tipping point is, you're going to submit a lot of people. If you're a day late and a dollar short, much fewer, okay? You have to be alert to this idea that you're on defense, offense. and it occurs at a critical tipping point. I will be showing you exactly what that tipping point is in every one of the escapes that I coach you through in this video. When you get to that tipping point, not only does the physical reality of the situation change, you go from a situation where you were restrained to one where now you can move freely. That's the physical element of the tipping point. There is a psychological phenomenon going on here too. You have to go from a defensive mindset to an offensive mindset. You have to go from a situation where you're thinking about defend, attack. Okay, and take advantage of that fleeting opportunity as your opponent is overextended, trying to hold on to a pin which has been broken. And in that momentary opportunity, you can submit a ton of people. This will be the pattern in every pin escape that I show you in this video. We'll be following, to the greatest degree possible, this maximizing approach. It begins with defense. I can't be pinned and extended, so bring your limbs in close to the body. So even though you're being pinned, you're not going to get finished. Okay? Getting pinned is one thing. Getting pinned and finished, that's completely unacceptable. That's another. Once we've gotten into the survival mode, then it's about getting out of the pin. And that starts with getting some form of inside position, sometimes more, sometimes less. Once we get inside position, we maneuver ourselves towards a critical tipping point where we're able to get a sufficient degree of inside position that we can break the pin. There will be a critical tipping point where the pin is broken, and now your whole psychology must change from one of defense into offense. And instead of putting your opponent back in guard, you're going to put them in some kind of counter offense. Ashigarami, arm bars, the clamp position. These are no more difficult to attain than it is to put your opponent back in guard. It costs you nothing extra, and the result is 10 times better. Instead of just putting them back in guard, you finish the motherfucker. Okay, that's the ultimate goal of the sport. And you come out looking like a stud. You were in trouble, next minute you finished them. That's what I want you to focus on as we go through all the techniques that we show you. So that's the big picture, guys. Step number 1, contraction. Bring everything in. It's bad to be pinned, but it's a lot worse to be pinned and extended. That's when he finishes you, not the other way around. Okay, so step number 1, contraction. Step number 2, sometimes yes, sometimes no, get the guy out of balance. Sometimes you don't need that, you can just skip that step, but a lot of times you do need it. Once you've gotten out of balance, you can suddenly start swimming your hands and start to gain inside position. So this will be step number 3. As you gain more and more inside position, there's going to come a critical tipping point. Step number 4, where a tipping point is reached, where we usually penetrate with either a knee, an elbow, sometimes 2 knees. Don't worry, I'll be showing that as we go through the moves. Where suddenly you can start to move very freely underneath your opponent, and he has now essentially lost control of your body. He no longer controls your movement. When you get to that critical tipping point, don't, as it were, limit yourself to the guard position. The guard position is a satisfactory outcome. Why go for a satisfactory outcome when you can go for an optimal outcome? The optimal outcome is submission. So the second you reach that critical tipping point, boom, go in and attack. And I'll say this again. It's no more difficult to put your opponent in Ashigarami than it is to put him in guard. It doesn't cost you anything extra, and the outcome is far, far better. You will see this pattern emerge time and time again in the various techniques and tactics as we go through this video. Okay, so we want to turn you into a master of escape from pins. First thing you got to learn, what are the 5 pins of Jiu-Jitsu? Lay down, buddy. Okay, first are side pins, where, as the name implies, I pin my opponent from across side, just like so, chest to chest, sometimes chest over face, and this is one form of pin. The other are north-south pins. What distinguishes north-south pins is that my hips are above the line of my opponent's shoulders. So in a side pin, there's Placido's shoulder line, my hips are below the shoulders. North-south is any situation where my hips are above the shoulder line. You can be completely north-south, but most north-south pins are actually slightly at an angle, okay? Doesn't matter, just as long as my hips are above the shoulder line, it's a north-south pin. Then we have mounted pins, like so, where my hips are on top of my opponent's hips and my head towards his head. This would not be a mounted pin in most forms of jiu-jitsu competition other than ADCC. Okay, so you have to face your opponent to count as a mounted pin in conventional approaches to jiu-jitsu. So this would be the mounted pin, many variations of this. Knee on belly would be here, where my knee goes across my training partner's stomach, my other leg is up, I can't have my knee on the floor, this won't count as knee on belly, and we play in this position like so. Then we have the rear mounted pin. Jiu-jitsu is unusual amongst grappling arts that you can count as pinning someone even when you're underneath, provided you are behind them. Okay, so this, if I have 2 feet hooked in like this on my opponent's legs, and some rule sets where I have my legs triangled around my opponent's body, this would be an example of a rear pin. Okay, there are other dominant positions that are not pins. Total position, ready? So here I have an excellent attacking position, but this is ostensibly a neutral position in the sport of jiu-jitsu. You don't get a score for this position, at least not for the position itself. But it is pretty dominant, so we'll spend some time looking at that too, how to get out of that position as well. Now, let's understand something right from the start. There are 5 scoring pins in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Sorry. Let me rephrase that. There are 3 scoring pins in the sport of jiu-jitsu, but 5 pins overall. Side pins and north-south pins do not score. They are dominant positions, but they don't score. The only pins that score in jiu-jitsu are pins that involve your legs. Lie down. Side control does not involve the use of my legs. It's my arms that form the primary control of my opponent's body. The same is true of north-south. The primary connection to them is through my arms. My legs play very little role in a north-south pin. Contrast this with the mount. My legs hook into my opponent's hips, and my legs are part of the pin. Knee on belly, same thing. Obviously, my legs are critical to the pin because that's my contact with my opponent. Rear mount, my legs hook in. And it's that hooking ability of the legs that creates the score. That's an important piece of information. So there's 5 pins in jiu-jitsu overall. 2 of them are arm dominant and 3 of them are leg dominant. Why do I bring this up? You already knew this, presumably, right? Why did I bring this up? I'll tell you why. Because it's extremely important in how we go to counterattack him when we're getting out of the pin. I distinguish between leg dominant pins and arm dominant pins for a very specific reason. Whenever I break out of a leg dominant pin, I go for leg locks. Whenever I break out of an arm dominant pin, I go for arm locks, followed by leg locks. What do I mean by this? If my opponent is, say, mounted on me, his primary connection to my body is through his legs. That means that any time the lock is broken, I'm right in on his legs. So the logical place for me to center my attack will be on Placido's legs, because that's the primary connection we have to each other. So that's the intelligent thing for me to do. Focus on his legs. Side control, on the other hand, it would be quite difficult for me to go directly into his legs. I can go indirectly into Placido's legs, but there's no real direct path because his legs are not around me, but his arms are around me. So in situations like this, the first attack is almost always going to be on the arms. Now, given that this is not a particularly strong form of attack, it's quite likely that Placido will go to pull away from me, and that will leave me into situations where we can go off into subsequent leg attacks. So as he denies me his upper body, he will leave me his lower body. So my general rule of thumb which we will follow throughout this approach, this maximizing approach to pin escapes, is to divide our opponent's pins into arm dominant and leg dominant. Whenever it's a leg dominant pin, mount, rear mount, knee on belly, attack his legs. Go straight for his legs. Whenever it's an arm dominant pin, north-south, or side pin, usually the attack starts at the arms, the upper body, and because our opponents try to pull away, we go indirectly into the legs. As he pulls away the upper body, if we don't get the submission at the upper body, we go straight down into his legs. That will be one of the big themes as we work through this video. I'll say it one more time. It's a simple rule, but it will guide your behavior when you're counterattacking out of pins. All of the leg dominant pins, mount, rear mount, knee on belly, when you escape, your primary target is your opponent's legs. Go straight into his legs. When your opponent's pin is arm dominant, side, north, south, your first attack will be on his arms. If you get the arms, congratulations, you won. If he pulls away from the arms, he will leave you his legs. Bam, go straight into the legs and get your finish. So the attacks on the legs are usually indirect when it comes to arm dominant pins. If you can follow that simple insight, that will guide you as we go through our counterattacks as we go further into this video.